Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for coming. This will be the last seminar from the current board of the ASGSA. And thanks, Dr. Hansen, for accepting our invitation to come here today. I'm sure everyone here knows Dr. Hansen, but just a little bit of his background. He received his bachelor's degree back in 1978 at the Illinois University. Then he went to Wisconsin for his master's and PhD.
Wow.
And in 1984, he came to UF and he's been here since that. So almost 40 years here, and he's our distinguished professor. And today he's going to share some of the experience that he had during this time. So let's welcome Dr. Hansen.
Thank you, Mariana. When you asked me to talk on this topic, I found it quite appealing and quite challenging. And some of my fellow office mates can tell you I've been running around asking everybody, so how do you think grad school has changed? It's really made me think about that question. So it's been a fun experience for me putting this seminar together. I have this little subtitle here, a perspective from an animal physiologist. Grad school experiences are different somewhat depending upon your discipline. So, this is my perspective based on my own experiences, not so much based on data, but I do have a little bit of data today. So thanks very much for allowing me the opportunity to contemplate how has graduate school changed since I first got involved in science. I heard some of you snickering. There were universities back in 1978. And how has the experience of grad school changed? How have grad students changed and the experience of grad school changed? So I have 3 parts to this talk. What has changed about graduate school? How about the students? Are the students who are graduate students today different than the students who were graduate students when I started graduate school in 1978? And are their motives the same? Are their motives for being in grad school different? Matt Groening, the guy who did The Simpsons, he had a series of cartoons on grad school, so you could see he was a little cynical about whether you should go to grad school or not. True or false? I'm a compulsive neurotic. I like my imagination crushed into dust. This is for Santos's. I enjoy being a professor's slave. My idea of a good time is using jargon and citing authorities. And I feel a deep need to continue the process of avoiding life. So I'm going to talk about who goes to grad school, what the practice of science is like today versus when I was in grad school, and a little bit about the experience of graduate school, the light at the end of the thesis. Can you see it? So those are the 3 kind of sections of this talk. Oop. So who goes to grad school? I think the people who go to grad school today are the same kind of people who went to grad school when I was a graduate student. And I think there's really 4 kinds of students. Students like me, I knew I wanted to be a research scientist my sophomore year in college, so I was just committed to that. Nothing else mattered to me. And, there's some people like that early in their education, they realize that the life of a scientist or an educator is appealing to them. And they go to grad school knowing what they want to be like by the time grad school's over. In animal science, we have a lot of students who don't actually want to go to grad school. They want to go to vet school. And they hope grad school is their ticket. And I'm sure in biomedical disciplines, there's a lot of grad students who really want to go to med school. And the way to get into med school is to get some graduate education. In our department, these kind of students are less common than they were when I first became a faculty member here in 1986. I think we discourage them from going to grad school. Not that they don't want to do it anymore. You know, and then there's also students who kind of like animal science, know they want to get more education, but don't exactly know what the best fit is for them. You know, how they're going to use their education after grad school. My guess is that's the biggest group of grad students. And then, you know, it is true, there's students who don't know what they want to do after their bachelor's. They're not really very satisfied with their job prospects right now. And so they go to grad school, if no other reason, offering a way to put off decisions. And when I was hired at University of Florida as an assistant professor in 1986, there was this movie by Rodney Dangerfield, was the lead actor, Back to School. So he played a man who owned a fat and tall store for big fat men. And he went back to college and he became the valedictorian. And at the end of the school year, he got to give the valedictorian address. And he said, and so to all you graduates, as you go out into the world, my advice to you is don't go. It's rough out there. Stay in school. You know, I think a lot of people go to grad school with that kind of thinking in mind. And it's a good idea. It's a good idea to go to grad school. These data are old, from 2015, but I'm sure that data would hold true in 2024. So in 2015, Georgetown University looked at the economic value of college majors for every discipline you could think of, including animal science. And in 2015, the average salary of people in the United States who got a bachelor's degree in animal sciences was $49,000 a year. And the average salary for people who went to grad school in animal sciences was $76,000. So there is value in going to grad school. It might not always feel like that, but it does pay off. You know, what has changed, I think, is not why students go to grad school, what their motivations are, but the demographics of who's in grad school has certainly changed since I was a grad student back in 1978. This is Eileen Mers. She had just finished her PhD degree with my major professor, Ed Hauser, when I got there in January 1978. There's definitely more women in graduate school today than there were in 1978, probably more women than men. Eileen was the first female PhD student of Lester Cassida. He had 64 PhD students, all men. And then he took Eileen, even though he believed women should not get PhDs, and then he retired before she finished. So my major professor supervised her for her PhD degree. She went on to have a very successful career in the pharmaceutical industry. But at that time, it was very unusual for women to get PhDs. When I was a grad student, there were several female graduate students, but it was still rare. There's obviously more students from underrepresented groups, a lot more Latinos, Asian Americans, still not enough African Americans. There's more than there were when I was a graduate student, but not enough. And obviously, all I got to do is look around this room. A lot more international students. And the particular makeup of the international student body seems to change depending upon local conditions in specific countries, economic opportunities in different countries. When I first got hired here, it seemed like all the grad students were from Venezuela. Then they were all from Brazil. And, you know, it just changes. But certainly, graduate school in the United States today is an international program, not a national program. And then I thought, well, is the grad students today different in their personalities and their makeup than the grad students when I was a graduate student? So I've been racking my brain about this a lot. And I think, no, they're pretty much the same. They look different, but they're pretty much the same. They're obviously more tech savvy. You guys are much more sophisticated with the use of computers and software than grad students were back in 1978. We didn't have personal computers or cell phones. So that's obvious change. You're more concerned with equity, being treated fairly, but I don't think you're treated any more fairly than when I was a grad student. And you're more concerned about work-life balance, but I think you work just as hard, have work-life imbalance as in 1978, but that really hasn't changed. You party less, I'm pretty sure, or you're partying without me, and I just don't know. But we got in a lot of trouble. And the big thing I've noticed is that nobody is familiar with all the great movies that were made in the 1970s. Like I had this undergrad, Luca, work with me. And I said, Luca, are you named after Luca Brasi? He goes, who? I said, you know, from The Godfather, the hitman. That's Luca Brasi. He didn't know who I was talking about. And then we do a lot of experiments in Mariana. And every time I drive up to Mariana, I tell my students, do you know Faye Dunaway was born in Mariana? They'll go, who? But, you know, Faye Dunaway from Chinatown and Bonnie and Clyde. And they just, no, these are good movies, people. So you need to watch them. This is a transition slide. I'll explain it. So in 2009, I was invited to Penn State University. They had an interdisciplinary reproductive biology program there, and they asked me to give a seminar at their retreat, kind of like our AMCB retreat. And I noticed that they had this great bonding game where people would put a sperm hat on and be blindfolded, and they would get spun around. And then somewhere there would be an egg. People on their team would direct them to the egg. Whoever fertilized the egg first won the game. So I thought that was good. So when I was there, I gave a seminar. And, you know, I remember this very well. There were 27 graduate students in the room. And I asked them, how many of you want a job like your major professor? And only 3 raised their hands. 3 out of 27. Everybody was in grad school, working on a master's or PhD. Almost nobody wanted a job like their major professor. That really shocked me. But that got me thinking, you know, why is that? Just this year, I was at University of Illinois in another room with probably 25 grad students. I said, who wants a job like their major professor? Nobody. So why? So then I thought, is this just a perception on my part? So this is me as a grad student. Haven't really changed, I know. So I just looked up all the papers from University of Wisconsin from the time I was a grad student and used my memory. How many of those guys or girls who got a PhD from 1978 to 1986, so more or less time I was in grad school, got a faculty job as their first major position? So you can see, I could remember about 19 students, 63% got a faculty job. Another 26% got a research job in either industry or science or government. One student went to work for an oil company, and one became a tech writer. So almost everybody who got a PhD at Wisconsin then got a job in research, and most of them got jobs as faculty members. So then I asked, well, what about my own students once I became a graduate mentor at Florida? So this is my first group of grad students in 1980, 5. I was at the vet school at the time. I had 11 students who got their PhD between 1989 and 1998. 7 of them, their first permanent position was as a faculty member, so a little over 60%. And then I had 10 PhD students from 1999 to 2008. 6 of them, their first permanent position was as a professor, assistant professor. But then from 2009 to 2018, next 10 years, again, I had about 11 students. Only 4 took a job at a university as a faculty member. And then the last 4 students that I've had, none of them took a job as a faculty member or wanted a job as a faculty member. It's not that they couldn't find them, they just weren't interested in them. So why is that? You guys can answer that, not me. But I think it's because graduate students see their mentor in action, and the job doesn't seem all that appealing. And in fact, the life of a faculty member has also changed since 1978. This hasn't changed. Fear of the tenure process. That's always been the case. And it's no harder to get tenure now than in 1978. This is an interesting cartoon. The tenure track timeline. I won't go through all of it, but there's the eager beaver new professor. But then in her first semester, she realizes, oh, I have so much teaching to do. I'm never going to get tenure. And then by 1 year, she's gained 15 pounds, 1 pound for each submitted proposal. And, she doesn't get funded until somewhere between year 2 or 3. Then she sees her graduate students presenting at a conference, which makes her feel like she really is a faculty member. Then she works as hard as possible to try to get tenure. And then she panics, but she gets tenure in the end. This has always been something that has been a big factor in grad student and faculty members' life. But like Jeff Dahl always told me and told everybody, they don't hire you at a university thinking you're not going to get tenure. They don't invest all the resources in you thinking they're going to fire you in 6 years. If you get a faculty job, except at Harvard, don't go to Harvard. They're invested in you. They expect you're going to succeed, and they're going to do everything to help you succeed. But there is more pressure for grants. It's a lot harder to get federal funding than it used to be, especially like in my field, reproductive biology, where there's about an 8% pay line from NIH. So, that's terrifying. And faculty are always complaining about how the reviewers just don't understand their research. There's less internal support, especially at land-grant universities and colleges of agriculture. There was always a lot of internal support for research. My major professor, I don't know if he ever got a grant, but he always had money from the College of Agriculture to do research. That's just not true anymore. You got to go out and get the money. This cartoon, tell that dishwasher that remote work is over. This is inaccurate because the university does not pay to give you a dishwasher, and you don't have an administrative person to send that email. When I was hired in 1986, we had a technician, everybody had a technician, everybody had a secretary. I still have a technician, thank goodness, but almost nobody else does that's funded by the department. There's no staff people to help you unless you get a grant and hire your own. So there's much less support for you as a faculty member. And, I'm not even going to go over the regulatory burden, but this is true. The quality control inspectors are here. There is so much oversight on what we do. We're constantly either training to understand the rules, trying to explain why we violated the rules. It is a burden. And it's not like we just sit around, teach, and do research. There's constant demands on a faculty member's time. So I like this. I'm just texting to confirm that you got my voicemail about the email with the link to the invite to join the chat, to schedule the Zoom meeting, to plan the webinar for the virtual conference. That is very typical. So I can see why you think being a faculty member is not all that great of a career. This is one of my favorite little, I don't know what this is, but I like this. How does an undergrad see a professor? God. How does a PhD student see a professor? Somebody yelling at them. How does a professor see a professor? Well, somebody winning an award. How does a technician see a professor? Somebody who's got the money. There are reasons to seek out a faculty job, despite all the nonsense that we have to put up with. It is still a great life. There is academic freedom. How many people, most people who have a job and they come up with an idea, their supervisor tells them, shut up, get back to work. We live a life where we can explore ideas as our imagination takes us. There's not many jobs like that. Even if you work in a company, they're going to tell you what to do. They're going to tell you what to do research on, when to stop doing research on it. You don't have any academic freedom. I was hired as an environmental physiologist. So I study effects of heat stress. I do a lot of work with embryos. But in my career, I've studied whatever interested me. I've studied immune function in the uterus of sheep. I got really interested in the biochemistry of serine proteinase inhibitors and published a paper on the biophysics of ovine uterine serpin. I got really interested in evolution and reproduction. So I published 2 papers on how some genes expressed in the uterus evolved in mammals. I wasn't hired to do that. I'm not a geneticist by training, but I'm very interested in genetics. I've worked with Raluca Minchescu, John Cole, and published papers on genetics. And, I've studied the sperm, even though I'm mostly focused on female reproduction. So I can do whatever I want to do, as long as I'm productive. And that's, how many jobs are there like that? And what does that mean? Life of the mind. It's our imagination, our thinking, ideas we get from our colleagues that drive us. And there's hardly any other positions like that. Yeah, taking a shower. That's where I get a lot of my ideas. That's why I'm not taking a shower in the building, okay? I want somebody stealing my idea when I'm in the shower. And, the joy of discovery. I found this slide after Dr. Bromfield told me that when he was a grad student, his major professor, Sarah Robertson, said to him, when you see something and you're the very first person in the world to see that, that's a great feeling. And that's what this woman is saying in this cartoon. The best part of science is knowing for a moment something that nobody else in the world knows. Or, like for me, they already know it, but I don't know they know it, so I think I discovered it. And, even if somebody else has discovered it, if you discover it for the first time, it's a fantastic feeling. Fame. If you're a successful faculty member, there is some fame involved. And you get to go to conferences around the world and people buy you dinner and you meet graduate students from around the world. That's pretty cool. But, keep in mind the fame of science is a lot different than the fame of like Caitlin Clark, for example. So here are probably the two most famous reproductive biologists in my lifetime: Robert Edwards, who got the Nobel Prize for discovery of IVF, Ian Wilmot, who cloned Dolly. So they both got a postage stamp. That's a lot of fame. But of course, they're from Great Britain. They never got a postage stamp in Great Britain. They have pictures of athletes and rock stars. But they did get stamps from these two countries that make money by selling stamps. So, you know, fame as a scientist is not quite the same as fame for other people. So Marilyn Monroe, 1950s movie star, said, "Fame doesn't fulfill you. It warms you a bit, but that warmth is temporary." And I think that's true. You know, for most scientists, fame is fleeting. But there's one other reason to become a professor, which to me is important. Oops, sorry. We actually do good in the world. You know, our research changes the world for the better, unless we're like nuclear weapons researchers. And, you know, even though most of us don't discover something that is an earth-shattering discovery that changes the paradigm, together as a community, we do change the world. And I like this cartoon here, the unknown chemist who did some very important groundwork. You know, a lot of what we do is not the great discovery, but the person who makes the great discovery was relying on us and others to come up with that discovery. So, you know, I know IFAS has calculated every dollar of research spent in agriculture has a 15-fold return to society. So sometimes you think, I'm doing this stupid thing here. I'm weighing out manure, and why am I doing this? Collectively, it really does make a difference in the world. And then education. You know, you go into class, you see all those undergrads with their computers open, shopping at Amazon. You think, I'm not reaching these people. But there are some people you reach in your life who you make a difference to. Undergrads, grad students, farmers. You know, you might not even realize it. You tell some farmer something and they act on it, and it changes their life a little bit. And occasionally people remember that 30 years later. Oh, he told me this, and, you know, it was a good idea. High school students. Yeah, being a professor, you can feel good about your life. I'm not saying you can't working for industry, but, you know, there's something unique about it. And then the last thing, when I started this talk, the salary part was going to be in the negatives. But actually, when I started digging into it, the salaries that faculty get are similar to the salaries that PhDs in science get working in disciplines outside of academia. So this is a graph from the American Association of University Professors showing changes in salaries for people at all sorts of different ranks. So in 2023, the average lecturer made about 76,000, the average assistant professor 92,000, average associate professor 106, 155,000 for the average professor in the United States. All faculty together, the average salary is about $112,000. And so I just started, you know, goofing around on Google. How much do PhDs make in industry? So these might be underestimates, because industry, you get bonuses, which you don't get in academia. But the cheeky scientist, this is a website designed to help PhDs who don't want to be in academia find employment outside of academia. So to kind of entice people into going to their website, they listed how much you can expect to make doing all these different jobs. You can see they're not too much different than the salaries that you would get in academia. Biggest one is a medical science liaison, which I couldn't figure out what that was.
Waiting.
Working to connect medical schools with the government and other organizations. But most of these salaries are pretty much in line with what you get in academia. Now, you can get bonuses, which you can't get usually in academia, but they're close. All right, that's the end of part one. So now I just want to talk about what is it like doing science today. You're all doing science as grad students versus doing science when I was a grad student. And I love this little cartoon. California Academy of Sciences posts these cartoons that students wrote or drew of scientists. And this kid really got scientists right. See, he points to the brain, creative mind for observing things. There's his notebook, journal to note down information weekly, eyes for seeing little details, goggles to protect the eyes. So what is it like doing science today versus science when I was a grad student? So I am going to introduce you to Rees Midgley, who's dead now. He was the director of the Center for Reproductive Sciences at University of Michigan Medical School, one of the most productive reproductive biology programs in the country when he was the director. And in 1987, it was the 20th anniversary of the Society for the Study of Reproduction. And they had their meeting at University of Illinois because that's where the society was founded. And then they asked Rees to talk about what was science like back then, kind of like the talk I'm giving. What is science like now? And Rees, what is science going to be like in the future? And, he was so prescient about what science was going to be like. And everybody was mad. They did not like what he had to say because they didn't like the picture of science that he was painting in the future. But it all came true. So he said, what about science as an activity? It used to be a hobby. There was no funding for science. So if you were a rich person and you were interested, you could do experiments. But even in universities, they didn't pay you to do experiments. You paid for them out of your pocket. He goes, in 1987, which is when he was talking, science is driven by the individual researcher, the individual professor, his ideas or her ideas, and the act on them. But he said that's not going to be true in the future. The individual PI is not going to be making the decisions about where science is going to go. That science is going to be organized in big scientific teams to solve big problems. And the individual scientist will have less of a role in the direction of the science. Is that true today? Partly true and increasingly true. So here's just one example. The Resilient Dairy Genome Project. This is a project funded by Genome Canada and the Canadian government, develop new genotypes for dairy cattle that are related to dairy cattle resilience, which you can argue about what that means. But there are 30 co-investigators on this project. Jose Santos is one of them. 35 international partner organizations. So the people participating in this are contributing to the advance of the research to meet the goals of this project, but in a much different way than just one person sitting in his lab or her lab with his grad students directing research. So, I think it pretty much came true. What about equipment? And people didn't like him saying this because it meant we were losing our academic freedom. He said, well, equipment, nobody made scientific equipment. You couldn't go to a company and get something. You built it yourself. And he goes, now in 1987, there are companies like Hofer, Biorad, and others that make equipment for us so we can just buy it. And he goes, in the future, we're not going to be able to afford equipment. Equipment is going to be too expensive. You're not going to be doing your own assays. There's going to be big multi-user core facilities, and they'll do the research for you. They'll do the assays for you. People did not like that. So, we still, I took this picture the other day, we still make some of our own culture media by scratch, just like people did back in 1987 or 1957. But not many people do that anymore. They buy everything, right? And I use core labs for everything, or not for everything, for a lot of things. So here at University of Florida, we have the Interdisciplinary Center for Biotechnology Research. They can do bioinformatics in a way that I can't do because I don't have the training. They have a flow cytometry core. We're not using that right now, but we have in the past. So right now, Camila Cuellar is working with Corwin Nelson, doing it herself. But in the past, we've depended on that core. We don't do our own electron microscopy. We go off to the EM core. Same way with gene expression, next-gen DNA sequencing. We've made monoclonal antibodies, but we've made it with the core, not on our own. And we've done proteomics. So in total, I've used all these cores in my research. So Reese Midgley was right. I don't have complete control of how these techniques are done. I'm depending on the expertise of the people in those core labs to guide me. So if they got it wrong and I don't know about it, my research might be in jeopardy. So people were mad that he said we were going to go to these large multi-user core facilities. And then cheating. He said, when science was a hobby, why would you cheat? He goes, but today some people cheat. But he said in the future, cheating is going to be very common because there's money to be made by cheating. And people were very furious about that. But he was right. I mean, I just read the other day of a Nobel Prize winner. 12 of his papers have data that appears in more than one paper. There's a lot of scientific fraud today. Ivan Oransky and Adam Marcus, they have this website, Retraction Watch. So they're always publishing news releases about papers that have either duplicated data or fraudulent data in them. A lot of Nobel Prize winners have been called out by these guys. So here's one of their tweets. Chemist under scrutiny resigns from Australian University. And in this article they wrote a few years ago, or actually 2023, for The Guardian, they said paper mills, scientific chop shops sell everything from authorships to entire manuscripts. Right? That's true. You can buy a paper, or you could pay to get your name put on a paper. In some countries, you get a big bonus for being on a paper for certain journals. And then, this is true. There's so much fraud today. When fraud is called out, the scientific community doesn't really know how to deal with it. Journals don't know how to deal with it. Editors don't know how to deal with it. So he says journals and publishers find ways to ignore criticism of what they've published. I think sometimes because they just don't know how to deal with it, leaving fatally flawed work unflagged. And then, this I know for a fact from an experience I was part of at the University of Florida, where somebody was cheating. Universities hardly have an incentive to air their dirty laundry, but in the vast majority of cases, they are left to investigate their own. That's right. If somebody accuses me of cheating, the University of Florida is going to investigate me. Well, they don't really want, their faculty to be caught cheating. University lawyers tell those in the know to say nothing. a form of academic omerta that lets fraudsters slip through the cracks. This was not an issue when I was a grad student. And what about predatory publishers? When I was a grad student, we published in the Journal of Animal Science, and if we were lucky, Biology Reproduction, and maybe Theriogenology. But today there's thousands of journals. And some of those journals are published by people who have no interest in science. They just know they can make money off of people who are desperate to have a publication. And those papers aren't even reviewed. And you have to pay a lot of money in terms of page charges. There's hundreds of these journals, maybe thousands of these journals. There's this very famous case. A group of computer scientists sent a paper to the International Journal of Advanced Computer Technology called "Get Me Off Your Effing Mailing List," except not effing. Every word in the paper was that line. Even the figures, "Get me off your effing mailing list." Everything was that sentence. They sent back reviews, good paper, should shorten the discussion, and it got published. And then they went to all the science magazines and said, look what we just did. HTTP Mail Avenger. So, this is a problem that we didn't face when I was a grad student. And I would add two other things about how science has changed. It's gotten faster. The rate of progress of science is so much faster today than when I was a grad student, mostly because of computers. We had to type our papers. We had to draw our graphs ourselves or hire an artist to draw our graphs. We didn't go to PubMed to find papers and download the PDF. We would read the back of a research article, look at the papers that seemed the most interesting, run off to the library, Xerox them. I still have them all. Xerox them and then put them in folders according to category. And when we wrote a paper, we pulled out the folders. Or maybe our major professors had journal subscriptions. We would try to borrow the right paper. It was hard. It's amazing to me how easy it is to find information today. So science got a lot faster, and it's also become less local, more global. Here's a paper I published last year, or I was a co-author on a paper published last year. 7 authors from 3 countries, from Ireland, 2 universities in Germany, 2 universities in the United States, right? And we all worked together by Zoom, by email. That would have been impossible when I was a grad student, but it's routine. One of the great things about going to scientific meetings is meeting people at other universities that you can work with intimately. So that didn't happen. So I'm almost done here, people. I just say a few words about what about the experience of grad school? What is it like being in grad school? Besides who you are and how you do science. More Matt Groening, the 5 secrets of grad school success. Do not annoy the professor. Be consistently mediocre. Avoid anything smacking of originality. Do exactly what you are told and stop reading this cartoon right now and get back to work. You're thinking that hasn't really changed. Believe it or not, you are paid more. You're not paid enough, but you are paid more than I was in 1978. I think I made $4,000 a year. Cost of living was less then, but just recently, I think this was Stanford University or Princeton University, looked at the average graduate student's salary relative to the local cost of living. So most grad students are making less than the cost of living, but not as much as it used to be. And actually 2 schools, Princeton and Yale, students are making more than the cost of living. So you are getting paid more. And I think that's going to continue. The gap between what you should get paid and what you are getting paid is going to continue to decrease. Students travel more and get some of their expenses reimbursed. These are some of my students going to the International Embryo Transfer Society meeting in New York City just before COVID, so they didn't know what was coming. When I was a grad student, if we wanted to go to a meeting, nobody paid for us to go, and we got in a car and we drove. So if it was in Arizona, we drove to Arizona, and we stayed in the cheapest place possible. It was very rare to travel far, but now not all students have the opportunity, but in general, there's a lot more travel. And I think it's true, there's more opportunities to do research outside of your home institution. That never happened when I was a grad student, but it seems to happen a lot. Students go all over the place to do their research. Laura Jensen, a master's student of mine, and Liz Janneman went to California, to Maddox Dairy to do an experiment. This is not Maddox Dairy, but it's within a few hundred miles. Luis Segura went to the University of Bonn in Germany. You know, that's more common than it was, which is a good thing. I think more research is expected for the degree. That's certainly true in physiology, that the body of work considered adequate for a PhD is more today than it was back when I was a grad student. Lester Cassett is a very famous reproductive physiologist in domestic animal reproduction. I mentioned him at the beginning of the seminar. He was at Wisconsin when I was there. He was retired. He was active 40 years. He graduated 64 PhD students. There was a Lester Cassett, a student probably in every land-grant university in the United States. So in 40 years, he got 64 PhD students. Here I am. I have been active 40 years. I've only had 33 PhD students. And I know I've worked just as hard as Lester Cassett, but more is required. Students have to do a lot of work before we say you got enough research for your PhD. One other thing, I don't really like this. The master's is slowly disappearing as a prerequisite for the PhD. So in animal science, we pretty much follow the traditional route to a PhD degree. Now you get a master's, then you get a PhD, then you go and get a permanent position. We have 12-month appointments for faculty, but we're gradually seeing what medical schools are doing and taking on some of their approaches. So more and more ag schools are getting rid of 12-month appointments and going with 9-month appointments because it's a way for faculty to get paid more and also be encouraged to write more grants. So with grad school, increasingly, the model for biomedical schools is you join a PhD program right away. You don't do a master's. You just do a PhD in about 3 years, maybe 4 years. If you're not doing well, they say, congratulations, you got your master's degree. Now get out of here, right? It's a failing degree. In animal science, it's I think, a badge of honor that you got a master's degree. But in biomedical school, a master's is something that students not on a research track get. And then historically in ag schools, after you get your PhD, you're ready to take on a permanent position. Whereas in biomedical schools, you're ready to do a postdoc, and then another postdoc, and another postdoc, and another postdoc, and eventually get a permanent position. I mean, I've talked to people in biomedical schools who say, you're not ready for a faculty position until you're 45. This is just my bias. Our PhDs are more qualified than the average PhD in a biomedical department. They get more attention, they get more experience. But in a biomedical school, they don't think of the PhD as a terminal degree. They think of the postdoc as the experience where you gain the skills to function as an independent faculty member. So I'm a great believer in postdocs. Not everybody can get a postdocs, like animal physiology, there's a lot of postdocs. Animal nutrition, probably not so much. I think they're great. But I think we should maintain a graduate education system that produces PhDs that, are ready to function as independent people. I showed a picture of that frazzled assistant professor trying to get tenure. She's really, like most assistant professors. I think you're going to be much less frazzled as an assistant professor if you've done a postdoc, because you'll have a few years in semi-independent setting, working with faculty as equals instead of as a student, and you'll be much more able to jump into a faculty position. So my last slide, sorry it took so long. When I was an undergrad at Illinois, all my general interest courses, I didn't really take them until I was a senior. So as a senior, I took all the freshman classes, which was super easy. And I remember I took Econ 101. I was the only senior with a bunch of new freshmen, and I just aced it, right? It was so easy. But I loved that course. And the one thing I remember about that course is that the professor kept saying that human beings function economically, not to maximize the amount of money they make, but to maximize their utility, the total satisfaction they have with their life. Might be money, might be children, it's whatever. And that humans function to maximize that utility. So the only advice I'd have for you, well, probably have a lot of advice, but the one piece of advice I'd have for you when you thinking about your own graduate experience is, maximize your utility. Don't do what your major professor says you should do, what your parents say you should do, what your friends say, what's going to make you the most happy. And if you're in grad school, you have the tools to reach that level of happiness. So live your life to try to maximize your utility. And I think you'll be okay. All righty.